There are stories that the world thinks it knows. And then there is the truth, the kind that takes decades to surface, carried quietly by those who lived it. For years, people close to Princess Diana whispered about what really happened behind the gilded walls of the British royal family. The pain she endured, the loneliness she suffered, the systemic indifference that left one of the most beloved women in history feeling utterly invisible. And now, after years of carefully chosen words and diplomatic silences, her son has finally spoken with a clarity that confirms what millions of people suspected all along. This is not just a story about a princess. This is a story about a woman who was failed, repeatedly, deliberately, and coldly, by the very institution she gave everything to serve. Before Diana Spencer ever became a princess, she was a child navigating one of the most painful domestic situations imaginable. Born in July 1961 at Sandringham, one of the Queen's private estates, Diana grew up in a household fractured by grief and tension. Her parents, Viscount and Viscountess Althorpe, were a couple unraveling slowly and painfully in front of their children. The death of a baby boy before Diana's birth had left a wound in the family that never properly healed, and by the time Diana was old enough to understand her surroundings, the atmosphere at home was heavy with unspoken sorrow. When her parents' marriage finally collapsed, Diana was just 7 years old. The custody battle that followed was brutal. Her mother Frances left, and Diana was raised primarily by a rotating series of nannies. She described, in her own words, the heartbreak of watching her mother cry every single Saturday evening as visiting hours ended. That image, a small child standing at a window watching her mother drive away, tells you everything about the emotional foundation Diana was building her life upon. It was shaky from the very beginning, and the people who should have steadied it largely looked the other way. When Diana married Prince Charles on July 29, 1981, the entire world celebrated. An estimated 750 million people watched the ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. She wore a dress with a 25-foot train. She looked, by every outward measure, like a fairy tale come to life. But behind that composed and radiant exterior, Diana was already unraveling. She had accepted Charles's proposal despite spending only a handful of occasions in his company. Despite his now infamous remark during the proposal, "I love you, whatever love means," Diana had pushed her doubts aside. She was young, overwhelmed, and surrounded by an institution that was not going to slow down for her emotional needs. Moving into Buckingham Palace after the engagement was announced, she found herself isolated and achingly lonely. Her job was gone. Her flatmates were gone. The warm, ordinary life she had quietly built for herself evaporated overnight. What followed in the years of their marriage was a systematic erosion of Diana's spirit. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles continued throughout their marriage, not hidden, not apologetic, simply ongoing. Diana once overheard Charles on the telephone telling Camilla that he would always love her, regardless of what happened. She later discovered a bracelet he had commissioned for Camilla, engraved with their private nicknames. In that moment, she seriously considered pulling out of the wedding. She confided in her sisters, who laughed and reminded her gently that her face was already on the tea towels. There was no turning back. What makes Diana's story so devastating is not simply that her marriage was unhappy. Unhappy marriages are tragically common. What makes it extraordinary is the scale of the suffering she endured in silence, and the degree to which the institution around her either ignored it or actively dismissed it. Diana developed bulimia not long after her engagement. She has spoken candidly about how the binging and purging began as a response to overwhelming stress, a way of exerting some form of control when everything else felt completely out of her hands. Rather than receiving compassion or proper treatment, she was largely left to manage it alone. The Queen reportedly attributed much of Charles and Diana's marital difficulties to Diana's eating disorder, framing it as the root of Charles's dissatisfaction rather than examining her son's behavior. The system protected the institution. Diana was left to protect herself. Her struggles went further still. During a particularly devastating argument with Charles, Diana threw herself down the stairs while pregnant with William. She later confirmed this was not an accident. It was an act of desperation. A woman so trapped in her pain, so utterly unseen by those around her, that she saw no other way to communicate the depth of her anguish. Charles's response, according to Diana, was to go horseback riding. Queen Elizabeth, to her credit, was reportedly disturbed by the incident. Charles appeared unmoved. Diana also spoke of cutting herself during arguments with Charles, not to harm herself in the conventional sense, but to force a reaction, to make visible the invisible wounds she was carrying. Charles's response was consistently dismissive, categorizing her behavior as attention-seeking rather than as the desperate cry for help that it clearly was. For a long time, the public had to piece together Diana's story through biographers, leaked recordings, and her own carefully granted interviews. Her sons, William and Harry, remained largely silent out of respect, grief, and the complicated loyalty that comes with being born into a family that is also an institution. But that silence has broken in recent years, and it is Harry who has spoken most directly. His candid admissions have not merely confirmed rumors. They have validated Diana's own account of her life in ways that carry extraordinary emotional weight. Harry has spoken openly about the culture of emotional suppression within the royal family, a culture Diana described in detail decades earlier. He has described reaching out for help during his own mental health crisis and being met with indifference and institutional concern about optics. He has spoken about his father's emotional unavailability following Diana's death, about being a grieving child who needed comfort and receiving protocol instead. These are not new accusations. Diana raised them herself, but hearing them confirmed by her son, in his own voice, from his own experience, closes the loop on something the world has long suspected. Diana was not exaggerating. She was not unstable. She was not, as some royal commentators preferred to suggest, simply unable to cope with the pressures of royal life. She was a human being placed inside an institution that had no language for her humanity, and she paid for that with her mental health, her marriage, and ultimately her life. It would be deeply unfair to tell Diana's story purely through the lens of her suffering, because that is not how she saw herself or how she chose to live. By the early 1990s, something remarkable had happened. Diana had begun to fight back, not with anger, but with purpose. She visited AIDS patients at a time when the disease carried such fear and stigma that many people refused to be in the same room as those infected. She did not merely shake hands with patients. She embraced them. She sat with them. She spoke about them with dignity and intelligence, pushing back against the cruelty of public ignorance. She visited landmine victims in Angola and Bosnia, walking across cleared fields in a flak jacket while diplomats debated policy from safe distances. She sat on hospital floors with sick children, held the hands of the dying, and listened to the stories of people society had decided were not worth hearing. And through all of it, she was a mother. Friends, staff, and her sons themselves have all confirmed that whatever was happening in her public life or her private heartbreak, Diana's devotion to William and Harry was absolute and unwavering. She took them to theme parks and McDonald's. She made sure they understood that life existed beyond palace walls. She told them they were loved, constantly and without condition, something she herself had never reliably received. Harry, in particular, has credited her warmth and openness as the emotional model he has tried to follow in his own life and parenting. By the mid-1990s, Diana had decided she was no longer willing to suffer quietly. Her 1995 interview with journalist Martin Bashir became one of the most watched television moments in British history. Sitting composed and direct, she confirmed her husband's affair, spoke about her own struggles, and delivered the line that has never left public consciousness, that there were 3 people in her marriage, and it was therefore somewhat crowded. The interview forced the palace's hand. Queen Elizabeth wrote to both Charles and Diana urging divorce, and the proceedings began. Even then, the battle continued. Reports emerged that Prince Philip had threatened to strip Diana of her royal title, Her Royal Highness. Diana's reported response was characteristically sharp. She reminded him that her title was considerably older than his. It was ultimately Prince William who stood in her corner most visibly. As a young man, he reportedly promised his mother that when he became king, he would restore her title. Whether he will honor that promise remains to be seen. But the fact that he made it, and that Harry has spoken about it, confirms something important. Diana raised sons who saw clearly what was done to her and refused to pretend otherwise. In the summer of 1997, Diana appeared freer and more herself than she had in years. She had emerged from her darkest periods. She was pursuing charitable work with focus and passion. She was in a relationship. She was, by all accounts of those closest to her, finally finding something that resembled peace. On August 31st, 1997, she died in a tunnel in Paris. The Mercedes she was traveling in crashed while being pursued by photographers. She was 36 years old. The world's grief was immediate, enormous, and complicated. Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace until they stood 5 feet deep. The royal family's initial silence in the face of that grief drew sharp public criticism. It was left to Prince Philip, whatever his flaws, to convince a hesitant William and Harry to walk behind their mother's coffin. His argument was simple and human. He told his grandson that if he walked, he would not regret it. And so they walked, 2 boys, a father, an uncle, and a grandfather, through London while the world watched and wept. Harry's decision to speak publicly, to step back from royal duties, to protect his own wife and child from the same machinery that consumed his mother, all of it is a confirmation. It confirms that Diana's fears were not paranoia. It confirms that her loneliness was real. It confirms that the institution prioritized its own preservation over the well-being of the people inside it. And it confirms that what Diana tried to tell the world about her life, in interviews, in letters, in the quietly devastating testimony of her own behavior, was true. She was failed, repeatedly, institutionally, and personally. But she was also extraordinary. She chose, in spite of everything, to spend her limited emotional reserves on people who had nothing to offer her in return. She changed public understanding of AIDS. She put landmines on the global agenda. She walked into hospital rooms and sat with the dying and made them feel seen. She raised 2 sons who, despite carrying enormous grief and complicated legacies, have both chosen to speak honestly rather than maintain a comfortable silence. Princess Diana once said that she wanted to be remembered as the queen of people's hearts. It was not a modest ambition, but it was an honest one, and it is one she achieved, not through title or ceremony, but through genuine human connection. The confirmation her son has now given the world does not change history. It does not undo the years of suffering or rewrite the ending of her story. But it matters, because truth matters. Because when a woman spends years telling the world who she is and what she is enduring, and the world spends years debating whether to believe her, having her own child stand up and say, "Yes, it was real, all of it," is a form of justice, however late it arrives. Diana deserved better. Her sons know it. The world knows it. And now, finally, it has been said clearly enough that no one can pretend otherwise.